All right, cool. We're recording.
Cool.
All right. Hello, Robert.
Hello.
So I was wondering, what book are you reading right now?
I'm reading a bunch of books right now. You put me on the spot. I'm not going to be able to remember them all, but I think I'm reading 9 books right now. Yeah, that's. It's hard to finish a book when you're reading that many. But one book I am reading right now is I Contain Multitudes, which is a book about microbes and the role that they play, the essential role they play in life, in life's processes, and it's about how our lives depend on the existence of organisms within us that are not technically part of us, but that we could not live without. Multicellular life could not exist without these independent organisms that happen to live in us. They're part of our basic life process.
Like what?
I don't know what they're called. I haven't picked that up in a few days, but as I understand it, at least from the author's description, we couldn't metabolize food without them, for example, and they're responsible for lots of elements of our evolution, not just humans, but multicellular life forms generally, and that's a fascinating perspective on evolution. There's I think a misconception about evolution that comes from Darwin and how Darwin has been interpreted, where evolution is primarily about struggle between organisms, but it's very much also a process of symbiosis in organisms. It's a process whereby to take it to the origin of multicellular life, individual cells join together to form multicellular organisms. So our existence as multicellular organisms is as much about cooperation as it is competition.
Wow. Hmm. So that's like that. An example of that could be like I think there's like a gut bacteria
Exactly.
in you. Oh
Yeah,
wow.
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So it's a popular science book. It's not technical. It's written for the educated layman. You probably enjoy it. I would recommend it.
Would another example of that be? Could it be like a virus, perhaps, that enters the body, and so the body actually becomes strengthened
Mm-hmm.
from that?
Yeah,
So
I
it
think
could work like that as well, not just.
absolutely.
Huh.
So he goes into our prejudice about our germophobia and our prejudice of microbes as being like causing disease and being invaders and harmful, which is certainly true in some cases, but in other cases it's very much the opposite. So we have this sort of one-sided and inaccurate view of what microbes entail to us, whereas the actuality is much more nuanced than that.
Interesting. Yeah, the collaborative aspect leading into evolution is interesting. Um, that makes me think also of just human to human, like the collaborative, the effects of collaboration. Well, it seems like it's difficult for us not to collaborate in a sense.
Yeah, we're intensely social humans, and I think the paradox of humans is we're the masters of the planet, but for animals of our size, we're very weak. And we don't have natural weapons like tigers or natural defenses. We're naked apes. In a lot of ways, we're vulnerable, but our vulnerability is, in a sense, our strength because it compels us, or is part of the reason that compels us to work together, and then working together we can do things that none of us would be able to do. You take a naked human and put them on an island and they're going to die. Chimpanzee might not. They might be quite well adapted to surviving on that particular island, but you put 100 humans on the island, they'll probably create something. Assuming that they have resources there, they'll be able to do all kinds of things that the chimpanzee wouldn't be able to do and thrive. And chimpanzees are, there's only a few of them left in the world, and every second there are thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of humans entering the world. So
Yeah, it's super weird to think about like how humans became so prevalent. Like if you were to ask me like which mammal or whatever would become, like, what plays the factor of which mammal would dominate the earth,
Mm-hmm.
it's hard to pinpoint exactly what that was, but I'd probably pick the one that was strongest or something.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so I guess humans, we use tools, I know that, but so I guess is that, I wonder if that's the factor that humans became so prevalent, the tool usage, and then is there like another example, I wonder, in mammals that can show us that, like, oh yeah, tool usage is, it allows animals to survive better, and do you understand
Yeah,
what I'm
sure.
saying?
Sure. I read another book recently on this subject. I showed it to you, in fact. It's called The Time Before History by Colin Tudge. And it's a great book about human evolution in the context of evolution generally. And it's not just that we happen to use tools, we're actually structured to use tools. Like, it's a byproduct, unforeseen, presumably unforeseen, byproduct of the fact that we're descended from primates who lived in trees, and we evolved thumbs as a way of grasping branches. And then when there were environmental shifts that depleted a lot of the forests, some branch of our ancestors learned to live outside of the trees and walk upright, and then they had those thumbs left over from the need to grasp branches, and they were able to find other uses for them. And as a consequence, it became increasingly useful for them to use tools. We're unique in that we have forelimbs that we don't use for locomotion. The way even apes that can stand upright to some degree, primarily walk with their front arms, but not humans. And that freed us up to exploit that the possibility of using tools. And then the more we use tools, the smarter we tended to grow over time. Our brains grew as a consequence of that over great lengths of time, and that in turn made having ever more dexterous hands to be ever more useful. So there's like an evolutionary feedback loop. This is the theory, at least, that led to humans having ever more dexterous hands and ever larger brains as a consequence of that. And that's not the only adaptation. We have a vocal adaptation. We have the ability to, according to this author, I believe he's correct, to make a range of sounds that most animals can't make. They don't have the ability to they don't have our vocal range, I guess is the simplest way to put it. And that enabled us to structure language in a way that most other animals would be incapable of it. Now, some animals do have a great vocal range. I'm thinking of like ravens, for example. They can make all kinds of sounds, and certain other animals can. But most of them have a very limited range of sounds that they're capable of making. So we have like our magic larynx, our magic thumbs, and our big brains, and our upright posture. Those are all unique human adaptations. No other animal has them. And it led to a situation on the planet that would have been, I presume, pretty hard to predict. You might have presumed that the elephants would become the dominant species on the planet, or the gorillas, or the lions, or something strong like you suggested. But it turned out to be a relatively weak animal who put all its chips on its brain and other adaptations, so to speak.
Yeah, you said a lot of interesting things there. Yeah, super interesting that I never thought of that. Most animals, we're really unique in the standpoint we have the arms that we can do stuff with,
Right.
stand on two legs.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also interesting because I know that I know that other mammals can stand on two legs, like meerkats.
Bears.
Some dogs even, they'll, like, when they're looking for a treat, they'll like stand up.
Leaning on something.
Yeah, sure. But I feel like with adaptation they probably could. So I don't know, it's just interesting, just a thought I had. It's very interesting that it's not more common if it would free up two hands or two limbs to do other things.
Mm-hmm. Why did it take so long for that to appear? And that's interesting. His Tudge, the author of the book that I'm referencing, he talks about how difficult that particular form was to evolve because a big brain is calorically expensive. He says that I believe the statistic he claimed was that 25% of our energy goes to our brain. A frog with a big brain, it'd be worse than useless. it wouldn't help them catch flies any better. It would just be this expensive organ that it wouldn't help them at all. Our brains would be useless if we didn't have hands, because we couldn't maximize the potential for utilizing our intelligence. That much intelligence wouldn't help another animal.
Oh, that is interesting. So it's almost like to best survive, you'd actually want to minimize
Yeah.
brain activity.
Yeah.
Wow.
You move in some other direction where your adaptations are efficient. And we just are the lucky ones, I guess, that, happened upon this particular form through evolutionary chance.
Wow.
If you want to call it luck, I don't know. Maybe, we're worse off for being intelligent. Who knows? But
Yeah. Evolution and history is so fascinating. Every time I read it, I do feel like it's like a lot of people, especially my age, don't find it as interesting as I do. Like at work, I'll be telling them, "Oh yeah, I'm learning about the agricultural revolution in class," and they're like, "Oh, that was like my least favorite subject in school, history 101."
right.
I was wondering, or have you noticed this too? And yeah, have you noticed that too, or is it just me? I don't
Oh,
know.
absolutely. That's well remarked upon. A lot of people, when they think about history, they just think about having to remember dates in high school or whatever, and they don't care about it. They don't care about it particularly. And like you, I find it utterly fascinating. But I mean, I always found it interesting as a subject, but it was relatively late in life that I became as interested in history as I have been. So I guess I can appreciate uh, the reluctance. It's such a huge topic. I mean, it's bigger than you could master in a lifetime. You could take many lifetimes to master history, and then more history will have occurred in that time. So it's always going to be bigger than our ability to understand it. We can just have an understanding, however imperfect, about history. And I consider those the same subject. To me, evolution is the history of species and the history of life, and what we conventionally call history is the history of humans from the agricultural revolution on, say.
Why do you think that history is becoming less interesting or less popular? Or do you think it's kind of unique to our generation, or do you think it's always been that?
I don't know that it's becoming less popular. I'd be curious to if there's any data on that. I would hope that it's becoming more popular because it's so much more accessible now, because there's ways of taking it in. You could watch YouTube endlessly and learn all kinds of things about history, and Wikipedia makes looking things up very easy in a way that maybe a dry textbook from the 50s might not have been able to do. There's certainly I think a renaissance in popular histories, and I think that there's an unfortunate tendency of intellectual people, including some I know, to kind of sneer at those, to look down on those because they're not scholarly. But I think that that's the wrong way to look at it. I think that that's a great way to look to get introduced to a phase of history, to a time and a place. And then if you do become more interested in it, then you can delve into more serious academic texts on that subject. But I'm all for popular histories. And I would include in that category historical fiction. I think historical fiction can be a great gateway into an interest in history. I myself, I think my interest in history came as a consequence of reading historical fiction, like The Three Musketeers, for example, is a novel that got me really interested in 17th century French history.
Why do you think it's important to be interested in history? I guess
I think there's a lot of benefits to knowing about history. George Santayana famously said that those who don't remember history are condemned to repeat it. Now, I tend to suspect that we're all destined to repeat it anyway, whether we know about it or not. I don't think there's any way around that. And I don't mean repeat it in the literal sense that the literal same events will occur, but there are patterns and themes in history that will tend to reoccur. I think one of the benefits, to me at least, is psychological. It puts my existence in a perspective that's quite humbling. I realize that I feel like I've lived forever. I feel quite old, but in the span of history, it's like I've lived less than 0.5% of recorded history, let alone the entirety of it. So I find a great utility in that, and just sort of being humbled by that, and also I think learning to appreciate what we have, because if you were suddenly forced to endure a standard of living comparable to people 1,000 years ago, it would be unbearable. We take all this technology, all these comforts and conveniences that we're surrounded by for granted, and it's hard not to take them for granted. I'm sure I do to a degree, but the more you study history, the more you can appreciate just how unusual that is. It's unusual that I'm speaking into a microphone right now. I'm recording a podcast for the internet, and all this would have been magic to people 1,000 years ago, or even 200 years ago.
Yeah, I think it was Donald Hebb, who's a Canadian psychologist. I don't know too much about him, but I know he said something that really interesting, that society and education and literacy, these all create a more stable environment, like emotionally stable. And with this stability, it's something along the lines of, with this stability, you don't become, let's see.
You gonna look it up?
Yeah.
It's okay.
Okay. So he said that, so the part of mankind that is admired and civilized and not constantly in a state of fear relies as much on our success in avoiding disturbing stimulation as it does on lowered sensitivity to fear-producing stimuli. So, like, when society grows, we get we're less in fear, basically, like, as we progress in society. And education is a form of uniformity, which creates stability, among other things. And so this uniformity of behavior and appearance reduces the frequency where we would encounter this states of fear. And so one might think that the emotional disturbances would decrease because of that.
Right.
But he states that it actually increases. And basically something along the lines of the uniformity of this appearance and social activity will make small deviations from the custom appear more strange and increasingly intolerable. And so that would mean there'd be more, I guess, deviations from the custom because the threshold would be lower. And so we would be becoming more sensitive to certain things, is basically his point. To drop back to what you were saying, you were mentioning about how we should be grateful for certain things, like just the fact that we're speaking into this microphone, and then people will, I guess, take for granted. I forget the exact verbiage you said, but anyways, basically what Hebb was saying was that the deviations will become smaller but more noticeable when we have more stability in society.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with Hebb. I'm not sure I've heard of him before. I see, as you're describing his ideas, I have a lot of sympathy with that. We spoke about the hedonic treadmill, which was the concept that it's supposedly well established that our expectations will rise or fall depending on our circumstances. So, for example, if you suffer a debilitating accident and you're paralyzed, of course you'll be utterly traumatized by that, but within 6 months to a year, you will, assuming you're still around, you will have approximately the same life satisfaction as you did before the accident. And similarly, if you are blessed with some great sudden fortune, say winning a settlement or the lottery or something, and you find yourself rich, you might be elated and happy as a consequence of that. But within 6 months to a year, your general level of life satisfaction will be approximately what it was before then. So it's like we have this is the claim, we have this sort of set level of satisfaction that our expectations will rise or fall to meet, depending, irregardless of our circumstances. Is that kind of like along the lines, do you think, of what he was talking about?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, I think
Okay.
so. Yeah. I also didn't do a good job explaining it.
No,
That
I thought you were clear.
that was just kind of a thought that appeared to me. But yeah, he was kind of saying that, and also the fact that we'll become more sensitive
Hmm.
to changes that I guess if you were to go back in time, we wouldn't be sensitive towards these
Right.
things.
Yeah.
And I kind of see that today as well.
Yeah.
Um,
We have elevated expectations of the world now. We imagine we could do anything, within reason. Everybody wants to be famous or rich or whatever. That's not something that I think tended to enter the mind of a medieval peasant.
right.
You know, the best you could hope for is to be warm and dry and not sick and well fed. That would be, and then your hope was for the next life. That you would ascend to heavenly kingdom after death. That was going to be your compensation. But we're not satisfied with that anymore. We need like greater rewards, tangible rewards.
Yeah, yeah. But it's interesting. So you said it's called the hedonic treadmill.
Correct.
But I guess why is it called? Why is it related to like hedonism?
Hedonism, right?
Because you could just say that maybe that's adaptability or.
Hedonism as a philosophy, as I understand it, is a little bit broader in its application than sort of the commonplace term use of the term. When we say hedonism in common parlance, we usually mean somebody who just lives for pleasure. But I think that hedonic philosophy is more about our relationship to pleasure, not so much necessarily, doesn't necessarily denote sort of just a obsessive elevation of pleasure as the highest good. Yeah, I'm not describing that well, but that's my understanding at least. It's a little bit, it's a more nuanced and broader term in its original and philosophical or psychological use.
I see. Yeah. Also, I read a book called Dopamine Nation.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Probably a lot of that has to do with dopamine. I
Sure.
feel like
Yeah.
because it is meant to fire. Dopamine's meant to be released. When you meet novel things, and when it gets released for a lot of different reasons, but one of the main releases of it is when you experience something novel or you're learning something new.
Mm-hmm.
And so it makes sense that I would release less when you have become accustomed to that thing, even if it once used to excite you.
Yeah.
Um, that also reminds me of another quote by Carl Jung, where he said that man can't stand a meaningless life, but it's almost like we're kind of programmed that way. We're programmed to be excited by novel things.
Mm-hmm.
And also, there's a great book, Maps of Meaning by Jordan Peterson,
Right.
which really, really goes in depth to the philosophical and neuroscience into that phenomena, basically.
Okay.
But yeah,
I've heard of Maps of Meaning. I haven't read it. I own a copy of Dopamine Nation. I have not yet read it. I've had it for a couple of years now. I'm sure the neurophysiology of that is fascinating, and maybe that's all it boils down to. And that's something I think about a lot now. Again, I don't know it technically, but I think the stimulation of staring at screens is very much something that we're addicted to. I certainly am. I never would have predicted 20 years ago that I would spend as little time reading books on page as I do now. And I very much find myself in a position where the screen calls me, I look at it, and then I rationalize it and say, oh, I'll do this, I'll do that on the screen. I look at the screen before I've decided why I want to look at it, and then I decide why I look at it. And I think I don't know if you want to go down that tangent, but that's certainly what I think of when I think of what you were just referring to, the neurophysiology stimulation. How did you put it? I don't recall your words.
Yeah, you got the gist of it. Yeah. I wanted to bring up something little different topic
Sure.
because you're really interested in philosophy, and I've asked several other people this question. I'd like to hear your opinion on it.
Please.
Do you think that we should always tell the truth? Big subject shift.
Well, should is once you say should, you're already in kind of in murky ground with me. I mean, it depends. Is there an intrinsic imperative to do anything? I don't know. I don't know that morality, which I presume you're referring to when you say should, is an intrinsic, or rather an extrinsic force in the world, but rather a human idea. So when you say should, I don't necessarily know what you're talking about.
Well, I guess, what if I asked if, in order to live your best life, you should only tell the truth? What do you think of that?
I have the same moral prejudices that most people have, and I prefer that people tell the truth than to lie. But I can think of many circumstances where not being strictly truthful might be preferable, even from a standard moral perspective. The classic example is, if a Nazi asks you if you have any Jews hiding in the attic, what do you tell them? You say no, right? Even if you do, because you don't want them to kill those people. So that's technically you're lying, right? But so always, I would say, based on my own moral prejudices, no, not always. There are more controversial and less stark examples where, I don't know, do you tell somebody something that would hurt their feelings? If you were to tell them the truth, and then in that case, do you lie, or do you sugarcoat it in some way, or what have you? Those are more realistic examples, and most of us are not confronted with the Jews in the attic question.
Right. I think that so there are some people. This is a debated topic, and there are some people who think that you should always tell the truth in order to live your best life. And sort of their response to that, what you stated was that the Nazi one is a bit extreme, but to the if you were to tell the truth, even if it would provoke consequences onto you, that in the long run that would basically still be the best option. Like a lot of people, like if your wife asked you, does this dress make me look fat, and you told her the truth, then in the long run, then that might be the best outcome for you. Now, there's also like some. It's not just that blatant, because you don't want to just say, yeah, you look fat. But I think there's a way of still saying the truth, I guess, wisely, if that makes sense.
I would say diplomatically.
Yeah. And not just saying no, when she is, or when, in your opinion, because then I could see how in the long run that could make you more miserable.
Sure.
But yeah, I was just curious.
I think it's very contextual, and I tend to agree that in virtually all circumstances, your happiness, if that's what you mean by best life, is probably best served by honesty than dishonesty. But when you put the question as starkly as that, it's easy to think of examples where I certainly wouldn't tell the truth.
Yeah. It's something I've been thinking about a lot. Also, really closely related to truth is wisdom. I've been thinking about that a lot lately. So the strange thing about wisdom to me is that it seems to always be on an assumption. Like not just wisdom even. It's like morality in general. There's always seems to be, and truth always seems to be based on an assumption. It's hard to chain it down to the ground, if that makes sense. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Can you give me an example?
Like with telling the truth, for example,
Okay.
it's easy to say that we should tell the truth in order to have a stable society in order for you to live your best life. But if you were to walk it back step by step to try to explain how that makes sense, eventually you'll come to a point where it can't really be explained in a sense. Like, you should always be honest. Okay, well, why? Because you'll, in the end, you'll live your best life. You'll get everything you deserve, let's say. And it's like, okay, how does that work? It's like, well, because you gave honesty, and so maybe you'll get reciprocated, or you'll end up somewhere that you'll have taken on the most responsibility in life, and eventually you'll walk backwards enough to where it's basically based on assumption or faith. And this is with a lot of different things, not just telling the truth, with like basically every moral principle I can think of, like generosity is a big one in Christianity. It's like, why should you give to the poor?
Right.
Well, because when you're poor, maybe they'll give to you. And it's like, okay, well, what difference would that make? Or you see, it's hard to tie it down to like why you actually should do something. That's what wisdom is, because it's like you should do this because throughout life we found that produces a good outcome, right? But it can't really be explained using science or using it can't be explained even. It'll end up there's like this. I forget the exact terminology, but there's like 3 axioms where if you walk backwards, it'll always end up with because God or whatever. It'll end up with it reassuring itself. So it's like, why should you do this? Because this, like, so the thing will end up being the starting point, basically. And then the third axiom was that it'll end up with a repeater. So it's like, why should you do this? Because of that. Why should you do that? Because of this. So it goes back and forth. And so with every moral principle, it usually ends up at one of these 3 axioms if you walk backwards.
Yeah, there's a circularity to it, if I understand what you were.
Yeah.
I'm reminded of David Hume when you're talking about that, where he says that reason is and ought to be the servant of the passions. So our passions are innate. Our preferences for this outcome versus that one aren't based in reason. They're based in instinct or just a feeling. And then reasons can help us, derive the result that we want. We can apply reason to achieving it, but it can't give us the reason. There's no, certainly there are those who dispute this, but there's no reason to prefer good to bad. We only just happen to prefer good to bad, and now reason can help us derive what we perceive as the good and avoid what we perceive as the bad.
Yeah.
So it's referred to as the is-ought distinction, and certainly that's been challenged and not to my satisfaction. No argument that I have seen has defeated Hume on this point, but I haven't studied it extensively. So, but as far as I'm concerned, there really aren't deep reasons for preferring anything. It's just there are organic reasons why we prefer to eat rather than starve, or for our loved ones to survive rather than die, or to live rather than die ourselves. But those I perceive as being instinctual imperatives of biological entities. And we don't have a reason for preferring to live. We just prefer to live.
Right. That's a great point. The thing that troubles me so much is that I think there's a lot of wisdom and I guess moral wisdom. I guess most wisdom is moral. That I feel like it does help a lot. That was created over many hundreds of years. This wisdom through many people dying and many people born and many time passing, civilizations changing, and then that kind of filtered the wisdom, and we have this wisdom today that really stood time, right? And so an example that I would say is like marriage is a sort of wisdom that it's like why do we have marriage? It's a strange thing. I mean, no other animal has that. Well, you know, a lot of animals that we think are monogamous, when you
Are
look,
not, yeah.
yeah, or like ducks, I thought were monogamous, but
Right.
when I looked into them more,
Mm-hmm.
they usually will change partners every season or every year, I think.
Oh, okay, I did not know that. I thought
Yeah.
that meant, okay, but please continue.
Um, and so yeah, so we have these tools that were evolved with wisdom, but then the whole tool that the whole tool is based on an assumption, and that's the difficult part for me. It's like why. So this tool is doing so much for us. Like marriage is huge, and it completely alters society, but it's hanging on nothing. Like it's just floating, and that's the strange part to me. Even the language we speak, in a sense, also it's like it's it troubles me because it's hard to you can't really explain these things. So then it's like, why should we do these things? Like, why should we look through? Why should we read wisdom and look to the past? Why should we do these things? And I know that I'm using the word should again, um, but that is also the problematic point. I feel it's like that it is maybe the word should. Like, why should we trust this thing when it's just floating? What benefit would it really have? And yeah, it's something I actually don't know the answer to, so I'm kind of just saying right now.
Your earlier point about social stability, I think, might have something to do with it. And again, I'm not addressing this from the perspective of should, but rather from the perspective of a society that's more stable might tend to outcompete societies that are less stable. So that becomes the justification.
Yeah.
You know.
But there's also the argument that if that was the case, then we could take it one step further than we're doing already now. So to create the most stable society, maybe we would maybe the most stable society is like a totalitarian state,
Sure, yeah.
or maybe the best society is one where we would kill old people and then give their organs to young people, or we create technology to where we can like kill people so that more people live like that. Everyone's heard that argument, obviously, and the that doesn't really work because the person who would preach that would have to be the first volunteer.
Right.
But I do feel like it's somewhat of a valid argument because that means there has to be a line drawn somewhere. Um, but yeah, I don't really know.
Well, I mean, maybe there's an optimal point of stability. I would think that you're right. A totalitarian society might be far more stable than a non-totalitarian society, and there could even be tangible advantages. China, for example, at least as I understand it, I haven't been there and I'm not an expert on it, but it's more authoritarian, say, than this society, and they handled COVID a lot better because they could do things on a dime that we couldn't do. We were incapable of doing it, but a society that is totalitarian or ultra stable presumably suppresses freedom, and that breeds discontent. So that's like a factor that would contribute to destabilizing it. And it's presumably a society of high conformity, which will stifle innovation and people creating new things, new inventions, and so forth. So a degree of instability would seem to have advantages too. And I mean, I would prefer a society that has some instability for that reason. I would prefer a society where people are free to speak their minds and to pursue theories and ideas that are contrary to what most people believe, and see what comes of that. So I'm trying to speak of it not in terms of should, but just in terms of what will tend to be effective or practical.
I guess so. To not speak in terms of should, something that I've noticed that I'm not sure what it means really, is that I've been thinking a lot about words as well, and I feel that words are not just objective words like a lot of people think they are. Each word conveys an idea.
Sure.
I was doing a lot of research into the word father, and I found it so interesting that through time the idea of father changed. Like it meant different things. It represented a different image, a different person. Originally it was something. It wasn't even in regards to a person. It was just something that protects another thing. So like if you were talking about a tree in reference to a mushroom and it protected it from the storm, you would use the without getting into all these details, you would use the first syllable of the word pater, which was like the first version of father, in front of the word tree when you're talking about in relationship to the mushroom because it protected it, and then eventually it meant shepherd and then father and blah blah. And so it's strange to see that like through history, the word changes, and it is a the word is up for interpretation. That's what it tells me. And so it's an idea that changes as perception changes through history, through time. And so and I don't think this is exclusive to it's not just for like father words or emotions or stuff like that where obviously those are up to interpretation, right? It's hard to describe the word fear or happy. But even to words like rock or even to like more physics words, it seems to represent sort of an image that I mean, Nietzsche said this too, that physics is the words we use for physics are related to our senses. It's not the actual objective thing. And so, yeah, I don't really know what to do with that, except that it does seem that words also that we use so frequently are just floating. Like they're not objective, but very much subjective.
There's so much there in what you just said. That's one of my biggest interests in philosophy is disentangling things from the terms that we use to describe them. Language is such a powerful tool, and we absolutely require it. It's the basis of all our achievements as a species. If we didn't have language and couldn't communicate complex concepts and denote particular things, we couldn't do much. But our languages are not synonymous with the things they're describing. We're drawing necessarily arbitrary boundaries around particular things and calling this that and this the other, whereas in reality, at least as I understand reality, all those things are part of a continuous flow. They're all, the boundaries between things are arbitrary. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Your example of the father, that's fascinating. We talked about that a little bit previously, but the idea that the word meant, if I understand you, protector before it meant progenitor. That might stem from a time before humans even understood that males played a role in reproduction. Did they necessarily understand that? They know that that women bear children, but did they know that they were impregnated by men? Did they understand the mechanics of that? Is my thought. That's a little bit of a side from your main point, perhaps.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that is an interesting thought. I mean, presumably, right? They had instincts to procreate, so they were doing that, and then later on, I guess they became aware eventually, right? That's how procreation worked, and then later on, probably they became aware that maybe the best chance for survival or they had a role essentially in the family unit. Yeah, that's really interesting.
So, I mean, there's a lot there. And you could probably do that with just about any word, right? How it's changed over time.
Yeah.
And, even, I can't think of an example offhand, but I think even in my lifetime, words have sort of acquired shades of meaning, like primary meanings that they didn't used to have. And
yeah, I know some are like I know the word retard. That definitely I feel like has changed. Like back before I was born, it sounded like it was used much more less as an insult, more of like an actual case. But now, now it's like you don't say that word because that's a severe insult now.
Right. Idiot was the same way. It was just a clinical term for somebody of substandard intellect or had some kind of cognitive deficiency. It wasn't an insult, but words like that do tend to become insults. Steven Pinker makes that point in The Blank Slate about how yesterday's politically correct term becomes tomorrow's insult because it's something that we tend to look down on as somebody of low intelligence. So if we create a word to denote such a person, that tends to become an insult, and then we have to come up with a new word that's like a new euphemism to describe that. Words like cripple were not insults, but now when we call somebody a cripple, that's kind of considered to be insulting. Now, then it became, what do we say now, differently abled is the term,
Special. I
right,
don't know.
or blind is bad. Now it's like unsighted or.
Yeah, now I notice that we try to turn it positive, which I don't know the impacts of that, but yeah, like someone is special or unique, or you don't use words that are negative connotation.
Or even really descriptive of what their situation is.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know how I feel about that. I feel it's a little tedious to keep up with that. I don't think that cripple is a insult. I mean, Jesus heals the cripple, right? He doesn't heal a differently abled person. So it's not. I don't think it has a. That's not original to me. I don't remember where I'm stealing that from, but maybe George Carlin did a skit on that about how we try to sanitize these unpleasant realities by putting new words on them, but it doesn't do anything. It doesn't change the old underlying circumstances of their predicament.
Yeah. I wanted to talk about one more different topic before we run out of time. It's basically in regards to how to live, which is kind of funny since what we were just talking about. But a specific aspect about it that I wanted to ask you about.
Okay.
So I read a lot of older text, and they have a lot to say about how to live, obviously. But it does seem that there is kind of two different, very common lines, I guess, that I didn't notice myself, but Carl Jung actually pointed out. And it was that there's a route for living that is very prescribed, let's say. Like you do this, follow this tradition, do this at this hour, etc. And then there's another route that is more like the individual way. I'm kind of putting words in his mouth. It's not a direct quote, but and so there is. So I want to focus on the individual way. So some examples of these would be like in the Analects by Confucius, he says to go vigorously without swerving. He doesn't say this is the individual way, but it follows the theme, you'll see. So like Confucius has a quote to go vigorously without swerving. There's also the story of Abraham in the Bible, which is very, I would say, individually. God tells him to go out, and then he goes out and encounters a lot of different things. He doesn't follow a set, I guess, regimen. But so the point I'm getting to is that so Carl Jung, so a patient asked Carl Jung one time how to live, and he answered it by saying that there was basically two kind of ways that you could live, the prescribed way or the individual way. And if you want to live the individual way, which is the way that you make for yourself, and which you don't know in advance, this is the way that simply comes into being of itself when you put one foot in front of the other. And this is the path prescribed by your unconscious. That's what Carl Jung thought. And basically that if you do with conviction the next and most necessary thing, then you are always doing something meaningful and intended by fate. And Carl Jung thought this was the way to the individual. Basically, the individual way was just one step forward. You can't see so far ahead, only the next step. And I was really curious what you thought about this, I guess, intuition of his.
Again, there's a lot there. Were you implying that the examples of Confucius and Abraham were examples of the individual path or of the prescribed path?
No, I think they're examples of the individual path.
Okay, that's interesting in and of itself, because I tend to associate, rightly or wrongly, the perspective of I think Confucius can be labeled a conservative and tradition-bound philosopher, and then certainly the case of Abraham as exemplifying the prescribed path. So
I definitely think that. Yeah, I think you're right. There are, like Confucius says, you should honor your parents and you should do this and that. I guess maybe I was just kind of pulling that out when, in relation to the whole text, I suppose if someone was to follow it down to a T, then it would be a good example of following a prescribed path. I just pulled that line out because I thought it was, so they go vigorously without swerving. I thought it was interesting that he doesn't elaborate on to like go vigorously following my rules, without swerving. But he was actually talking about it in relationships to creativity and art, and so I guess I could have clarified that. And then with Abraham, I guess I was looking at I was thinking that it does actually exemplify an individual way because, well, I guess why did you think that it didn't?
I probably more prejudice than any other reason. And famously, Abraham obeys God right up to the point of murdering his own son. Now, in most versions of the story, God saves, what is it?
Isaac. I think Isaac, yeah.
I can't remember. But he was going to do it.
Right.
So that, I guess that's probably what I was thinking of.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a weird story. I've thought about that one a lot. Like I've read Fear and Trembling by Kierkegaard, and everyone seems to have a different take on that. So I'm not really sure what to make of it.
Have you read the whole thing? I mean, sorry, it's a little bit of a tangent, but I haven't read that one.
The whole thing of Fear and Trembling, yeah. The book that it comes in has like 5 different books in it, but the whole thing of the Fear and Trembling section, yeah.
But my copy is although I haven't read it, is just that. But I mean, back to your point about, are you asking me which of those paths I think is the appropriate one or the better one?
Okay, so maybe disregard the Abraham and Confucius thing, but I'm really curious on the point that Carl Jung made, where the path to the individual way is, I think he even says another time that people are concerned with how one ought to live, but that's the wrong question. One lives as one can, essentially. And then he makes the point that to live the individual way, you take one step in front of another, and that's basically the path that he uses unconscious because he is deeply involved in that.
Sure.
But just this pathway of just doing the next most necessary thing with conviction, it will lead you to a meaningful life, he says, and probably the best life if he said that. I mean, meaningful and best, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm no expert on living, so I don't, my approach to this subject is going to be intellectual and hypothetical. It's not going to be based on my own, experience so much because, I haven't done a great job of that, although maybe better in recent years. It seems to me it might be useful to dichotomize between those two paths, sort of as an intellectual exercise, but that most of us, if not all of us, are going to walk some middle path between those extremes. I think it's impossible to live completely individualistically for the reasons that we started this conversation. We're such a social species. Everything we do, including our very language and our thoughts are conditioned to some degree by the society that we happen to find ourselves in, where we happen to be born. And even if we're reacting against it, even if we're rejecting it, it's still profoundly influential on what we will do, right? So it's not like any of us is a blank slate and can walk some path that's completely unprecedented or completely unique. In the case of the more individualist path, I should say rather in the case of the conservative or how did you put it? What was the term you used?
Prescribed.
Prescribed path.
Yeah.
I think that can certainly be limiting. It's almost limiting by definition. People find, I think, psychologically comforting that um, they do what is prescribed from their faith or from their ancestral traditions or whatever. Like you in the Jewish tradition, you get a bar mitzvah and then you're a man, so you have like a set moment where childhood is over and manhood begins. And for example, and there are many parallels in other traditions, and you get married and you have children and you uh, you observe religion, religious observances and holidays, and you do your duty, and if called to war you fight, and all these other imperatives from society. And I think there's a lot of comfort in that you're absolved of the need to do that for yourself, to make your own path. So I can see the appeal of that, but it seems limiting to me, and I think I'm more inclined to favor the path of individuality to the degree that we can walk it.
Yeah, that's a great point, great explanation. I just find it's a very interesting claim, I guess you would put it, or a very interesting thing to say, the path that he laid out for the individual way, because it seems very based on intuition.
Mm-hmm.
Now, he was very deeply into religious studies and stuff,
Sure.
so I mean it makes sense, but it kind of runs sort of counter to nowadays. Things are becoming very rational, like you should plan logically everything.
Right.
But I guess he doesn't say not to do that, but he says to do the next most necessary thing. I know that Jordan Peterson also kind of says something similar to that, and not exactly like that, but that basically if you don't know what to do, you should do the first thing that I guess calls to you. Like maybe your books are out of place, so put them away.
Yeah.
That seems to be kind of his philosophy. I mean,
that is like clean your room thing.
Yeah. That's I think that's basically what it means. It's like, do the thing that's in front of you. If you don't know what to do, you look around you and then do that thing, and then there will be something else. It's like, okay, I cleaned these books. Oh, now I need to clean this rug, and then eventually that kind of helps you get set up.
Orient yourself, sure.
Yeah. I do think that the individual way is not necessarily isolated, but like I think that Carl Jung thought everyone was unique and had like a different path, and that's why you couldn't prescribe someone something. So the individual way didn't necessarily mean isolated from others, but just your own way, I guess. But yeah, anyways. Oh yeah, and another thing that in related to how to live as well, that I found was interesting that I wanted to hear your thoughts on. Unless you had anything to say on what I just said, basically. I was kind of just summarizing.
I could go on, but I'd rather hear your next point.
Yeah. I was just curious real quick on the relationship between the younger and older generation. I found this is a very interesting relation. I feel like a lot of times there's some tension between the two.
Sure.
And I think that's because usually the older the older generation will have like tradition, let's say, and then the younger generation will want to do things its own way. And I think that a lot of conflict has happened by this, just in relationships and and bigger than just in your relationship as well, have stemmed from this. And I guess I was trying to think of a solution for it, because I know that tradition is important, because I feel like tradition is a way to teach wisdom in a sense. Tradition usually carries wisdom. It carries a deeper meaning. Like even Christmas traditionally was to celebrate the birth of Christ, and which symbolizes a lot of different stuff, right? And so usually tradition is very symbolic, but a lot of tension also can come from it. I wanted to know your thoughts on this very broad topic and what to do, I guess, about this conflict.
The first thing I think of when you bring up that issue is Will Durant, the historian, and a couple places he makes the point that he thinks that it's good that the youth provoke the old, and that the old constrain the youth. He sees that as a productive tension, not as a problem to be solved, but rather a balance to be struck, because there's utility in both of those tendencies, even if they're working um, in opposition to each other. It's a productive opposition. Does that make sense?
Yes, but I'm curious to hear more if you can.
So he actually, it's funny that's the point he ends the last book of his long career on. That's literally where he closes.
Uh-huh.
So I don't know if that was a coincidence or not. I mean, he finished that book in his 90s, and now he had made the point elsewhere before then. So I mean, he did repeat a lot of the points that he made. But I find it interesting that he closed his last book on that very point. And if I think that what's going on there is physiological. I think that young people necessarily are looking to create themselves, to individuate themselves, and are filled with opposition and rebellious energy, and that has a positive and a negative aspect. I mean, it could go in a positive or negative direction. And older people, likewise, physiologically, are more inclined to be sedentary and conservative, and that has advantages and disadvantages too. The advantage would be like the stability that we were talking about earlier, and the hard-won wisdom of ages. The negative aspect would be that it could stifle ideas that are legitimate. It won't accept them. Which ideas that are every great idea had to come from someplace, and it was met with some opposition. When it invented it, I don't think there are any exceptions to that. So striking a balance between these competing tendencies is I think more the challenge than resolving that tension or getting rid of it. That might be a worse outcome, I think, because it has a social function.
What would be the worst outcome, sir?
Like abolishing, if we could. I don't think we can, but I mean abolishing this tension between generations. But rather just accepting it as part of the human condition. The young people will. The young people now will be middle aged at some point. They'll be dealing with this from the other end. So it's not going away. It will not disappear as long as humans are structured the way they are. It's just an inevitable conflict between generations that'll occur. I have read that one of the strongest social indicators that there is going to be a major rebellion in a society is when the demographics are lopsided, so that there are a lot more young people. Like the Arab Spring, for example. I don't know if you are familiar with that or remember that.
No.
It was the upheaval in the Arab world in like back around 2010, 2011, and of course there are proximate and ultimate causes, but so the proximate cause would have been a lot of the social repression that was over there, but there was the ultimate cause, or one of the ultimate causes is you had a very young population. You had a lot of young people. The distribution in a society between young and old isn't a constant at all. Similarly, in the United States in the 60s, which is famously a rebellious decade, there was the baby boom that came about after World War II. There was suddenly just a large percentage of the population were in their adolescence and their early adulthood. And the consequence of that was the upheaval in the Western world that took place in the 60s. So it's just something that will happen.
Wow, that's an interesting point, actually, because it's like if you have more youth,
Mm-hmm.
there is more potential, you could say, because the youth usually are the ones that innovate,
Mm-hmm.
but there's also how it's like a double-edged sword, kind of. There's a lot of potential, but
Mm-hmm.
then maybe there's a lot of mistakes to be made, or a lot of controversy.
It's rather than looking at one is good and the other bad, they're both good and both bad, depending on, you know. An analogy I would use might be something like an engine. Like, what is a internal combustion engine? It's a controlled explosion, right? The explosion is taking place within it, and the older generation might be the engine, and the younger generation is the fuel inside the engine, is the explosion, right? And the explosion isn't going to do anything for us if it's not inside the engine, you know, and the engine won't do anything without the fuel. So it's like they need each other, even though they're
Interesting, yeah. Maybe that's one of the reasons that I know there's a lot of ancient text or old text that really pushes that you should honor your father and mother,
Sure.
you should honor
Yeah,
your parents, and maybe that was kind of, among other things, a solution to try to keep you can't eradicate the tension, but you know, you certainly can accept your differences between your parents and yourself and honor them. And I hadn't drawn that connection because I've always wondered why there's so much insistence on honoring your parents.
because there's, I think, a predisposition not to. You know, why would you have to keep saying that if there wasn't some, you know, predisposition not to?
Yeah.
Right. So.
All right. Well, Robert.
Are we done?
Yeah, that's
right.
it. Thank you so much for your
Oh, it was my
time.
pleasure. I hope we recorded it correctly this time.
Thanks. I
Yeah,
think we're
all right.
good. All right. Thank you, Robert.
Absolutely. My pleasure.